when it comes to impartiality regarding party politics. However, I think in regards to ideological impartiality, the BBC is clearly failing. When it comes to the ideology of critical social justice, what has become known colloquially as the woke movement, the BBC, in my view, clearly has a bias. Actually, I think it has a rather extreme bias, and this explains why so many people no longer trust its reporting. I know from personal anecdotes from employees at the BBC that there is a kind of internal struggle going on to overcome the problem. But nobody I've spoken to denies that the problem exists. The evidence of it is everywhere. You might have seen that educational film by the BBC called Identity, Understanding Sexual and Gender Identities, which was aimed at 9 to 12-year-olds. Let's have a look at it.
What are the different gender identities?
That's a really, really exciting question to ask.
Do you know there are so many gender identities? So we know we've got male and female, but there are over 100, if not more, gender identities now. So we know that some people might feel like they're two different genders, so people might think they're bi-gender, and then you've got some people who might call themselves genderqueer, who are just like, I don't really want to be anything in particular, I'm just going to be me.
So where is the balance there? Why is the BBC making pseudo-religious proclamations to children as though they were uncontested fact? The BBC News website also routinely publishes items about male rapists, murderers and sex offenders, but misreports them as being female. You might recall a news story last December on the BBC with the headline, "Predatory woman who incited man to abuse child for jailed." Now, at no point in this article does the writer tell you that the predator in question is a man. You have to rely on the evidence of your own eyes to get to the truth. This is not journalism, it's propaganda. But perhaps most damning of all is the question of the WPATH files. In March of this year, a series of internal documents and videos from the World Professional Association for Transgender Health were leaked to journalist Michael Schellenberger. As Mia Hughes' report for the Environmental Progress think tank revealed, these leaks showed that members of the world's leading global authority in gender treatment were engaging in medical malpractice. There are messages proving that surgeons and therapists are aware that a significant proportion of young people referred to gender clinicians suffer from mental health problems. They reveal that some specialists associated with WPATH are proceeding with treatment in the knowledge that no consent has been secured from either the children or those responsible for their well-being. And they have also withheld from patients details of potential lifelong complications, or continued down this path knowing that the children do not understand the implications. Now that is a huge story. It's probably the biggest medical scandal of the century. This is why I covered it in a 2-hour special of Free Speech Nation. And yet, if you search for the WPATH files on the BBC News website, what do you get? Precisely nothing. In fact, in the 24 hours after this major story broke, here are some of the stories that the BBC did report on. Colin Firth's wet shirt from Pride and Prejudice on sale, University of Essex campus cat honoured with statue, recycling bin shake-up for Highland households, Winchester Park and Ride buses to run on vegetable oil, more beavers released in Craig Ormes National Park. Now, all of these stories were apparently far more important than a global authority in medicine sanctioning the experimental treatment and irreversible surgery on children who were unable to consent. But you know, why talk about that when you can focus on beavers and recycling bins? 4 months later, and there's still no mention of the WPATH files on the BBC News' website, in spite of repeated efforts by campaigners to get them to pay attention and just mention it. It's as though it just didn't happen. But surely that would change this week, wouldn't it? Because news broke that staff in the office of Rachel Levine, the Assistant Secretary for Health at the Department of Health of the Biden administration, allegedly put pressure on WPATH and pushed for the removal of trans surgery age restrictions. And the draft guidelines had intended to lower the age minimums to 14 for hormonal treatments, 15 for mastectomies, 16 for breast augmentation and 17 for genital surgery. But when version 8 of the WPATH Standards of Care came out, there were no age restrictions at all. In fact, this scandal of Rachel Levine's office allegedly influencing the WPATH Standards of Care is so huge that the White House has put out a statement this week saying they oppose all surgery for minors who identify as trans. So given the White House's statement and the severity of the allegations, surely the BBC would report on it, but no, they haven't. Not a peep. Another important news story completely memory holed. Is it a coincidence that these stories might threaten the very ideology that the BBC seems to be promoting? It's difficult to see what other conclusion we could possibly reach. Well, I wanted to give the BBC an opportunity to explain itself. So on March the 11th, I emailed the BBC press office to ask why it had chosen not to cover the WPATH files. Over the following month, I contacted them on 5 different occasions, and I was ignored every single time, even after the release of the Cass review and Dr. Cass's explicit criticism of the influence of WPATH on the NHS. And finally, on April the 12th, the BBC press office did send me a reply, and it was the following statement. News items are chosen by the news editors of the day based on a number of factors. Now, of course, that doesn't remotely answer my question. So why is the BBC press office being so slippery and evasive? Well, perhaps the answer lies in an article written by a journalist at the BBC, a whistleblower, using the pseudonym Charlie Walsham. Here's what he wrote for The Spectator. Regrettably, I believe there is a straight line between the BBC's capitulation to extreme trans rights ideologies and the disturbing findings in Dr. Hilary Cass's 388-page report. Crucially, what Dr. Cass has exposed was only able to happen because of a skewed and distorted national conversation around the issue of sex and gender, a narrative aided by the nation's broadcaster. Dissenting voices have been marginalised, castigated, cancelled, silenced. The article goes on to provide a litany of examples of how the BBC has covered up stories or silenced those within the organisation who wish to expose the truth. And in a follow-up article, Walsham wrote about how, since he blew the whistle, BBC employees were trying to identify him and get him fired. And this, of course, proved why it was so important for him to remain anonymous in the first place. This is an ideology that will not tolerate dissent. And unfortunately, it looks very much as though it has fully infected the BBC. Well, I thought I'd give the BBC one more chance to respond, so I emailed yesterday with a series of questions. I asked why, still to this date, they haven't covered the WPATH files. Here was their answer. News items are chosen by the news editors of the day based on a number of factors. So, just the same non-reply as before. Perhaps that's the only sentence they know how to write. Now, all of this is very reminiscent of the no-debate approach adopted by Stonewall since around 2015. And, of course, the Nolan Investigates podcast in 2021 revealed that Stonewall has a huge influence on BBC policy, in spite of former CEO of Stonewall, Nancy Kelly's claim that the charity didn't have any influence at all. Somebody is not telling the truth here. And when a number of articles appeared in the national press which questioned Stonewall's recent ideological shift, including one by Matthew Parris, who was one of Stonewall's co-founders, the official Stonewall Twitter account retorted with, "You okay, hun?" Now, that is the kind of thing I expect from Stonewall, but I have higher expectations from the BBC. So it's disturbing that in the face of serious and legitimate questions, the press office of our national broadcaster thinks it's acceptable to resort to evasion, flippancy and, yes, downright rudeness. Well, I'd like to extend an open invitation to anyone from the BBC press office to appear on this show at any time. I'd be really keen to hear their side of the story. I think the British public deserves to know why its state broadcaster behaves as it does. There should be an inquiry. There are many theories. BBC insiders have told me that it's partly down to LGBT staff networks who consistently attempt to influence the decisions of editors. And as we know, activists of this kind can be very intimidating. So is that the reason? Or perhaps it's to do with the fact that the BBC has what they call an identity unit, which provides correspondents to appear on programmes and gathers news on behalf of the channel. Is the identity unit exerting undue influence when it comes to these contentious topics? Well, we won't know because they won't answer the questions. In fact, the very existence of an identity unit does seem to suggest ideological capture. I mean, who else has such units? What function do they serve? The BBC says it wants to make cuts, so why don't they start there? By eliminating the identity unit, the BBC could simultaneously fulfil 2 of its objectives. It could save money and it could make itself less biased. I want the BBC to do better. I believe it's an important institution, which is why I think it needs to be held to account for these failings. For all its efforts to remain impartial on party politics, it's absolutely clear by now that it cannot do so when it comes to ideology. Like Stonewall, it can't even answer basic questions anymore. It's just putting its fingers into its ears. But for a state broadcaster funded by taxpayers, that's simply not good enough. The public deserves